And yeah, shall we get started?
Fine with me.
Okay, well, this is our last Beacon talk of this term before the summer starts. And it's my pleasure to introduce Anastasia Kianaga, who did her PhD with Tobias Egner at Duke, is that right?
Yes.
And then did a postdoc in Berkeley, working primarily with Mark Esposito, before starting her own group as an assistant professor at the University of California in San Diego. And today she'll be talking about competition and control in working memory. So yeah, thank you very much for joining us, especially at the unusual morning hour.
Ungodly hour.
I would suggest that unless there's clarification questions, people kind of either put questions in the chat or save them for the end. How do you feel about that? Or would you prefer to be interrupted?
Yeah, I don't mind either way. I will tell you, I'm very bad at monitoring the chat and seeing the chat while I'm speaking. So if there's something that is unclear, I'm gonna blow through kind of a lot. So yeah, don't hesitate to interrupt and ask for clarification. I don't mind taking questions, but I may miss the chat if that's where they're coming in.
Okay, I can keep an eye on questions in the chat as well, and then try to bring them to your attention at the end. All right. Oh, well, thank you very much. We're looking forward to your talk.
Yes, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I did not realize it was the final talk of the term, so it's a lot of pressure, but it's great to sort of see you all. So today you can see my screen, okay? I no longer have my indication there. Okay. So today I'm going to give a somewhat sweeping overview of a number of studies spanning back to when I was in grad school and during my postdoc, as well as just a little bit of what my new and budding lab is up to now. But they all revolve around the general question of how our internally maintained goals reciprocally interact with other demands and other cognitive processes. So, as humans, we have what I think is a remarkable ability to guide our behavior based on goal information that's internally generated and maintained. And that's in contrast to information that's only available out there in the environment. And I think you're all probably pretty familiar with this short-term goal maintenance ability and know it as working memory. But the way that working memory has often been studied in the lab is basically the equivalent of this, having participants remember just incredibly simple stimuli in a vacuum with no other demands or distractions. And of course, that's been critical, fundamental, research to establish our understanding of basic properties of working memory. But I think of working memory as so remarkable because in daily lives, we find ourselves just trying to achieve, multiple goals, moment to moment, both big and small, constantly relying on this ability to do so. Well, we also face a continuous stream of interference from competing perceptual input and other immediate demands for our attention in the environment. So working memory needs to concurrently hold on to multiple types of goals for use at multiple points in time while completing more immediate tasks. And the overarching, research question that I've been pursuing is how do we do this? And how do these different types of goals and uses influence how working memory is stored? Because the maintenance process for keeping information in mind, it can take a few forms. It's sometimes a verbal rehearsal or sometimes a visual refreshing process. And we use this basic maintenance ability to hold information in several sensory modalities, but also at several levels, including abstract goals that shape an entire episode or context-specific task rules, as well as the concrete sensory information that contributes to meeting those rules or that represents the recent sensory past to help bridge moments of perceptual experience. And then the short-term goal maintenance, it also supports and reciprocally interacts with a bunch of other processes like learning, decision-making, and many others. So I think of working memory as a ubiquitous contributor to all these other processes that we care about, which means that it can influence and be influenced by processing in other domains. And this can sometimes produce unwanted consequences. So for instance, our goal information can sometimes become degraded or displaced by incoming perceptual input or concurrent demands. On the flip side, our maintained content can sometimes bleed over into other tasks, driving our attention in the environment. So for instance, we found across many studies, several of these in collaboration with David Soto, that visual attention is captured by stimuli in the environment that match the features of what's being maintained in working memory, even if you're not looking for those stimuli. And I think many of us can relate to this phenomenon where you notice something out in the world that just happened to be going through your mind, which we may often think of as a coincidence. But I think this sort of occurrence can teach us about the neural systems for representing and prioritizing our short-term goals, where information that's activated in working memory wins the competition for attention, which is adaptive because that working memory content, it's usually relevant to our current goals. But the sort of attentional capture by working memory, it can also happen at the expense of attending to perceptual stimuli that are actually more immediately relevant. Because we use working memory to hold information for future goals while we go about other behaviors, those other behaviors may sometimes be biased by our working memory. So, imagine you're at the grocery store, reminding yourself to buy apples, but then while you envision those apples, your attention gets captured by, the tomato display, and then you start thinking about making salsa and you forget about the apples that you need. And what I mean when I say that this can teach us about the neural systems for working memory is that we would predict this sort of interference effect to arise if working memory shared neural content representations with perceptual processing. So for the purposes of this talk, when we see these sorts of interactions between working memory and other demands, I'm going to refer to that as competition. But even though this occasionally impairs behavior, our work suggests that these interactions emerge from the efficient structure of a generally adaptive system where the same cortical real estate may be multi-purposed for a variety of processes. So I think we can harness these, sometimes vulnerabilities as a window into the structure and function of the system by examining when they do and don't occur. Because actually, these kinds of flukes that harm performance or interfere with working memory are relatively rare. We notice our failures more when you struggle to remember the security code that was just texted to you, or you get into the kitchen and forget why you went in there in the first place. And working memory gets a ton of flack for being severely capacity limited. But for the most part, we remember our short-term goals impressively well, and we'd be pretty debilitated if we couldn't. And I can tell you from personal experience that I've tried many, many different ways of distracting and disrupting participants during working memory maintenance. And they're annoyingly good at remembering everything despite my best efforts. So in other words, we likely engage some form of control, whether volitional or involuntary, to reduce competition and promote successful behavior. And our research has found that the functions that accomplish this control over working memory may be similar to the way that attention is controlled, in the environment. For instance, holding information in working memory can result in inhibition of perceptual processing for similar stimuli that might otherwise compete, meaning that processing can actually suffer for stimuli in the environment that are similar but not identical to the features of what's being maintained in working memory. But this then serves to sharpen processing and improve retention for the working memory content. And this is akin to the center surround inhibition that occurs in visuospatial attention. Maintaining a color word in working memory can also produce conflict in a simple perceptual color naming task, akin to a classic Stroop effect, meaning that color naming is slowed by remembering an incompatible word, even when the word is only in your mind and not currently being perceived. And this working memory streak effect, it's modulated by similar factors that control conflict in a standard color word streak, for instance, like the proportion of compatible trials in the experiment. And the same sorts of sequential or trial history effects that adaptively modulate perception and attention, they occur in working memory as well. So together, these suggest that working memory may rely on some of the same domain general attentional functions as perception. And of course, we're not the first to suggest this. This line of work follows from so much of Kiyonaga's early work showing how attention is modulated within working memory. And actually, so much of what I'm going to talk about today is inspired by and related to a lot of the work that you all have going on there. But together, these findings support the theoretical perspective that working memory maintenance is an attentional function of endogenously activating the same content representations that are activated by perceptual processing, a theory that's typically referred to as sensory or sensory motor recruitment. According to this perspective, the frontoparietal delay activity that we typically see during working memory, it actually reflects attentional signals, and those signals bias activity in sensory and other regions where the content-specific feature information itself is held. But this model has been the subject of lots of debate over the past several years, and it's at odds with many studies that instead do detect feature-specific working memory delay activity in frontoparietal regions, especially studies that use direct electrophysiological recordings in monkeys. And if working memory does in fact rely on sensory cortex and attention, then it also provokes some looming questions about how working memory content can withstand incoming perceptual input or survive when attention is directed elsewhere. And we know from many empirical studies, but also just from daily life, that we don't automatically lose all of our working memory content as soon as we perceive new input or briefly direct attention elsewhere. It's still pretty unclear when and why working memory will be susceptible to distraction, which calls some of the tenets of this theory into question. So in my research, I often manipulate competition with working memory, using this competition as a tool to test theories like sensory recruitment. So my approach has been to try to challenge working memory in different ways in order to understand it, taking the philosophy that we should study working memory in the context of other demands because that may influence or change how it operates. So first, I'm going to address how working memory is influenced when attention is occupied by another task. Then I'm going to look at the reciprocal side of that, how other tasks are influenced by what's being held in working memory. And then these earlier studies also inspired some bigger questions about the role of frontoparietal regions in working memory maintenance and why these regions are so often implicated in content representation if they're really playing an attentional role. And then so I'll briefly address that in a final study. So I'm going to describe two related fMRI studies where different attentional demands were embedded during working memory maintenance. And this first experiment manipulates the difficulty or time consumption of a visual attention task that's completed during maintenance, with the expectation that this should consequently influence the quality of the maintained representations. And here we tested this using neuroimaging to gauge the discriminability of the activation patterns associated with the working memory content. Specifically, while we measured brain activity with fMRI, participants completed a task where they remembered an item over a delay of several seconds. Then during the delay, they completed a series of visual search trials where the task was to report the orientation of the one and only vertical item in the array. And then they were tested on their memory of the initial sample. But on individual trials, the memory sample could be either a face or a house, and the visual search distractors could be either more or less discriminable from the target. So we would expect on the trials when the search targets and distractors are harder to tell apart, that this task would occupy attention for longer periods of time and might therefore cause the working memory representation to deteriorate. We tested this by training classifiers on the patterns of responses associated with face and house stimuli, using fMRI data from the cortical regions that preferentially respond to those stimulus classes. And then during working memory maintenance, while participants performed this delay spanning task, we tested whether those classifiers could tell whether the maintained stimulus was a face or a house. So, for this study, the discriminability of multivariate sensory patterns, or accuracy for classifying the working memory stimulus as a face or a house, it's serving as a proxy for the strength of the maintained representations. So here I'm going to plot classifier accuracy, and I'm going to do that separately for the two visual search difficulty conditions at each time point across the trial. And we see that decoding is highly accurate when the working memory stimulus is being displayed, like we would expect when the stimulus is actually being perceived. And then it drops off precipitously during the delay. But critically, while classification stays above chance in the easier search condition, plotted here in gray, it drops a chance in the harder condition, plotted here in orange. So this suggests that sensory working memory representations can be eroded by concurrent attentional demands, or at least that these particular signals are conveying less diagnostic information about what's being remembered. This is nice because it supports my expectations, but what I neglected to show you here is that working memory behavior, participants' ability to remember the initial stimulus at the end of the trial, that was essentially fine, despite this barrage of visual demand. So what does that mean about the role of these sensory activation patterns if working memory performance survives basically unaffected when what we've been referring to as the representation becomes undetectable? So clearly these sensory patterns alone can't be the end of the story. And as many of you know, right now there are a lot of different ideas floating around to explain the seeming discrepancy between fluctuating neural activation patterns and behavior. One working theory is that additional regions, particularly in the parietal cortex, may be recruited to represent working memory content, specifically when working memory is faced with additional demands and when sensory representations may be especially vulnerable. And the idea is that signals from these other regions might bridge disruptions and reinstate the sensory cortical patterns when it comes time to retrieve or report on the working memory content. So this idea is informed by other data from the Desposito lab. Here I'm showing Elizabeth Lawrence's work, indicating that working memory information in early visual cortex may be biased or corrupted by distraction, while representational information from the intraparietal sulcus is less precise, but unbiased. And those stimulus-specific parietal signals only emerge in the event when there is a distraction present. In my data set, the univariate signals from a similar region of parietal cortex strongly and uniquely correlate with working memory behavioral performance. So that at least corroborates the idea that this region may be especially important when competition with working memory is heightened, and it may be impossible to maintain, a normal unencumbered sensory representation. This may be one solution, and there may be others, to protect working memory content from competition or distraction by changing the way that it's maintained. In this case, switching from a high resolution sensory representation to a lower resolution parietal one. But this falls underneath the umbrella of a broader idea that working memory content may be maintained in different ways to suit the circumstances and can take on different activation states, where those different states would influence how working memory content interacts with other types of processing. And much of this work is going on here in the Stokes and Nobre labs. So I just wanted to briefly mention some brand new behavioral data from my lab with no context, because I'm excited about it. This is a study that was led by my grad student, Dylan, and an undergrad, Kathy. And we find that when attention is shifted among multiple items that are held in working memory, the prioritized or attended working memory content is actually more susceptible to certain forms of perceptual interference, while deprioritized or unattended working memory content seems instead to get a boost from certain forms of perceptual input that might otherwise interfere. So I just mentioned that with very little detail to segue into the idea that working memory content may be flexibly shifted into different states of maintenance that can fundamentally alter how it interacts with other demands. But of course, brain regions don't just operate in complete isolation. So my assumption is that distributed representations at different levels of abstraction and possibly using different neural codes may be flexibly recruited to help bridge disruptions and distractions when necessary. I don't have a ton of data to speak to this idea yet. I'm just going to briefly describe a study that takes a different analytical approach by examining whole brain network level functional connectivity. And I think this could be an informative method to address how multiple regions can interact and coordinate their activity when working memory is faced with different demands. So, functional connectivity measures correlated fluctuations in bold signal between regions. And graph theory is a mathematical approach that can be applied to these signals to quantify brain network structure. The basic approach is to correlate the activity between every region or network node and every other node. And then the strength of those correlations tells us which regions tend to activate together in networks. This allows us to describe properties of large-scale brain organization, like the integrity of differentiated modular communities across the brain. But this network configuration can also shift depending on the current context. So for instance, when cognitive demands increase, it may require coordination across multiple functions, and that could be achieved by increased connectivity between otherwise separable networks. So as it relates to the previous study, while local patterns of activity reflecting the precise features of what's being maintained may fluctuate with competition, representations at different levels may coordinate via network interactions to overcome that competition. So the study tests the idea that this sort of network reconfiguration may be a means to overcome competing demands with working memory. So I'm still analyzing these data, and I'm only going to describe the study in broad terms. But we used a very similar task to the last experiment and added another factor during the delay, so that working memory could be challenged by either an attentional demand, a perceptual interference, or a combination of the two. And I don't want you to get bogged down by the details here. I just want you to get the gist that two, theoretically distinct kinds of demand were manipulated during working memory maintenance, and working memory performance or accuracy was worst in the condition when those demands were combined. But our primary question here was how network level interactions may reconfigure during working memory maintenance as a function of these competitive demands. So first, I'm going to show you how the global whole brain network structure differed across these different task conditions. I'm going to assess that using a measure called modularity, which describes the configuration of the brain into separable subnetworks. So where a higher modularity score indicates more differentiated networks, and a lower modularity score indicates more connectivity or communication between networks. And we see that when only perceptual competition is high, modularity is increased, suggesting that there's relatively less communication between networks. But when perceptual and attentional demands are combined, modularity is decreased instead, indicating that whole brain networks are the most integrated in this most demanding condition, suggesting that increased communication between networks may be necessary when task demands are the most complex. But I also think this interaction suggests that there may be different optimal network solutions to manage different kinds of competitive demand. So the way that working memory is challenged will influence how brain networks configure to manage that competition. In addition to examining this whole brain modularity measure, we can also quantify the connectivity properties of individual nodes, both within and between networks. And here I'm going to show a map of changes in a measure of within network connectivity as perceptual interference in the task increased, with more yellow nodes indicating increased connectivity within their own network, while bluer nodes decrease their connectivity instead. And I don't want you to try and parse the meaning of all these individual node changes, but you can see that regions along the intraparietal sulcus show selective reconfigurations of their functional connectivity when dual task distraction increased and is more perceptually interfering with working memory. So this is just some more kind of convergent evidence for the unique engagement of particular parietal regions to support working memory in the face of greater demands, where that parietal role may supplement sensory cortical representations when they're most susceptible to interference, either from perceptual input or attentional disruption. So it looks like sensory working memory patterns may be disrupted by intervening attentional demands, but working memory behavior can still survive, which may be possible for several reasons. Working memory networks may reconfigure depending on the current dual task demand, and the locus and format of working memory representational information may shift in the face of competition. So there isn't some static working memory storage locker, not that you thought there was, but the maintenance processes and storage substrates may adapt to current demand, making them flexible to incoming perceptual inputs and attentional disruption. Okay. So if working memory content adapts to current demands and can take on different activation states that are functionally distinct, which not only influence how susceptible working memory is to perceptual input, but also how working memory drives or influences other ongoing behaviors. I mentioned earlier that our working memory content may sometimes inadvertently influence our visual attention in the environment. And we think that this arises from the adaptive role of working memory in guiding cognition, where it would typically be favorable to enhance processing of stimuli that match what's being held internally. So if that's the case, and working memory is really sharing content representations with sensory and motor processing, then we might expect to see a similar bleed over of working memory content into the execution of actions. Because at the end of the day, why are we keeping this stuff in mind? The ultimate objective of working memory is not to just support what we think, but what we actually do. But like in perception, this generally adaptive purpose, it might also sometimes produce flukes in behavior. And I think it could explain, for instance, why you might sometimes accidentally type out or speak the wrong word aloud in conversation if it was going through your mind. So we're going to examine this kind of competition or action slip as a way to probe functional states of working memory maintenance. Because like I mentioned earlier, there's now an acknowledgement that working memory information can take on multiple activation states, whereby neural activity patterns like multivariate sensory patterns of activity fluctuate with the current task relevance or attentional priority level of the working memory content. And if these activation patterns are functionally meaningful, then these fluctuations should relate to and translate into behavior somehow. And an output gating mechanism has recently been proposed whereby corticostriatal loops are engaged to control the selection and use of information from working memory. This model would predict that attentionally prioritized working memory content would be the most likely to be gated out to control motor planning. But since our working memory often operates while we're engaged in more immediate actions, our hypothesis was that active working memory representations that are above a certain threshold could be inadvertently gated out when we don't necessarily want them to be, resulting in these so-called action slips. So here I'm first going to describe whether this kind of behavior is in fact triggered by working memory maintenance, and if so, how it can be controlled. Then I'll describe a causal test of this hypothesized corticostriatal circuitry using TMS. So to do this, we approximated a very, very simple scenario where information was maintained for future use while performing immediate actions. And this experiment was conducted by Berkeley grad student Jacob Miller. So in this task, participants were asked just to remember a simple directional word, either left, right, up, or down. Then after a brief delay, complete an intervening motor task where a central colored square cued a mouse movement to one of 4 screen locations. And participants were trained beforehand to associate each of 4 colors with one location. So for instance, green for left, blue for down, and so on. Then after another brief delay, they were given a match, non-match probe for their memory of the word from the beginning of the trial. But on individual trials, the meaning of the working memory sample could be either compatible or incompatible with the direction of the cued hand movement. So with the incompatible example here, the cued direction of motion is to the right, which differs from the meaning of the word held in working memory, which is down. And I'm going to focus on the comparison between these trial types in motor behavior as our measure of competition. So if motor performance is relatively impaired on incompatible trials, it would provide evidence that the working memory content is interacting with our action goals. So first, I'll examine the course that hand movements took using cursor path data to test whether there's a basic competition effect. And we can get all kinds of really cool measures from this movement data. But for instance, on compatible trials, we might expect movements to quickly and directly reach their target, resulting in a movement path that looks something like this. Whereas in incompatible trials, we might expect movements to first head towards the direction of what's being held in working memory, only to correct course and ultimately land at the proper target, resulting in a movement path that looks something like this. And when we compare cursor paths for compatible and incompatible trials, this is in fact what we see. These off-course cursor paths that need to be adjusted to arrive at the correct target, they're much more frequent on incompatible trials. So this effect indicates that the meaning of working memory content can actually shape the trajectory of hand movements, consistent with the idea that working memory and motor processing are sharing representations. But we're not just talking about minute decrements in perceptual processing here, but dramatic shifts in the course of motor behavior. But if this effect does arise from the adaptive role of working memory maintenance, then these sorts of slips should also be modulated by the relevance of the maintained content to our current goals. So we also manipulated relevance in several ways, but one way was by varying the proportion of compatible to incompatible trials in blocks of the experiment. So for instance, there were highly predictive blocks where compatible trials were more likely, and we might expect working memory content to exert a greater influence over behavior, as well as anti-predictive blocks when compatible trials were unlikely, and we might expect the working memory content to exert less influence over behavior as compared to neutral blocks when compatible and incompatible trials were equally likely. So any differences between these block conditions would serve as a measure of control over the competition between our working memory content and our action goals. So when we look at movement speeds, we see that even accurate movements also take much longer on incompatible trials. But the effect is magnified in predictive blocks when the working memory content is most likely to help the motor task. Here I'm just plotting this effect as a difference score to illustrate this point that the more highly relevant the working memory content, the stronger its influence over motor behavior, shown here in green. So this tells us that while our working memory content does interact with ongoing motor behavior, we are able to strategically prioritize based on the task context and exert some control over this competition. So then we examined what neural circuitry supports this control. Our approach was guided by previous studies indicating that selective use of working memory representations is associated with increased functional connectivity between the lateral PFC and the caudate nucleus of the striatum. So we perturbed this circuitry to test whether it does in fact play a causal role in controlling working memory motor interactions. Specifically, we use transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, wherein brief magnetic pulses are applied on the scalp over a target area of cortex, which can result in either increased or decreased cortical excitability, depending of the stimulated region and connected regions, depending on a number of factors like the frequency, intensity, and pattern of pulses. And this can be a really powerful approach to causally test predictions about how observed activations functionally support behaviors. So following that prior research, we targeted a lateral frontal region based on its connectivity with the striatum. And then we perturbed activity in that region with TMS. And here we used both an excitatory and an inhibitory stimulation protocol on different days so that they could serve as active controls for each other. And we use what's known as an offline theta burst TMS protocol, meaning that first stimulation was delivered to perturb neural activity, and then participants performed the task after the stimulation was complete, but during the time frame when it should continue to have a lingering effect on cortical excitability. So if our behavioral competition effect does in fact depend on this circuit, then it should be modulated by the stimulation. And if corticostriatal interactions control working memory output gating, inhibition of the circuit might blunt the impact of working memory content on actions, while excitation of the circuit might magnify it instead. And these data also have a lot going on, and I'm not going to get into the complexities, but I'm just going to give a snapshot of the behavior. Here, comparing movement accuracy as a function of the stimulation condition. We also administered a no TMS control condition to confirm that the behavioral pattern replicated in this new cohort. And we can see that they show a competition effect like the other cohort. When we plot it as a difference score, we see a small but highly significant competition effect that it varies little with block condition. However, after continuous, which is presumably inhibitory TMS, the competition effect is eliminated selectively in the anti-predictive block condition. While after intermittent or presumably excitatory stimulation, the effect is instead magnified in the predictive block condition. So this suggests, in other words, that inhibitory TMS further inhibited the lowest priority working memory content, or prevented sort of low energy stimuli from being gated out, and minimized the competition between working memory and motor behavior. While excitatory TMS further excited just the highest priority working memory content, or facilitated high energy stimuli being gated out and magnified this competition effect instead. So in short, excitatory and inhibitory TMS have dissociable impacts on behavior, supporting the idea that this frontostriatal circuit may control the interplay between our internal content and externally oriented actions. And because the impact of TMS differs between block conditions, it indicates that the circuit controls competition in a context-dependent way. So this last study showed that we can adaptively control the interplay between our internally maintained working memory content and our actions based on their task relevance. So, we don't just start screaming out every thought running through our minds or wildly flailing our arms because we're thinking of a direction word, but it's the correspondence between the goals of our internal maintenance and the concurrent demands that that engenders this interaction. And together with other data, context cues and attentional prioritization can modulate the interplay between working memory and ongoing processing, presumably through some modulation of the item or task representations. Okay, so finally, hopefully somewhat quickly, these and other studies inspired for me and my colleagues a rethinking of all these debates between, frontoparietal versus sensory storage, or persistent activity versus latent maintenance, and that, these don't need to be either or solutions, and the brain can likely support several different ways to hold our goal information, depending on the unique factors of the context. One of those factors that comes into play when we use working memory in daily life is our knowledge and our experience with the task and the stimulus content. So some of my colleagues and I undertook a unique study where we trained ourselves on a variety of tasks and stimuli over several months of learning to test how that influenced a number of memory-related processes. So specifically, we wondered if this approach could help to reconcile discrepancies between the many studies that find support for frontal working memory storage versus those that don't. As in, monkey ephys consistently finds evidence for working memory stimulus selectivity in prefrontal firing, whereas human fMRI is more consistently supported the idea that stimulus feature information is represented in sensory regions instead. Of course, there are many differences between the species and also between the resolution and of the recording methods. But another huge methodological difference is that monkeys undergo months of training and thousands of trials to reach a criterion of performance that humans can achieve immediately. So we wondered whether all that task training and stimulus exposure might promote distinct working memory maintenance processes or stimulus representation codes. So we reasoned that we might be able to bridge, at least part of the divide between the human fMRI and monkey ephys findings by training and testing a small cohort of humans extensively over months of repeated stimulus exposure and repeated task performance. And like I said, the 3 participants that we subjected to this training were ourselves. So we generated thousands of unique kaleidoscopic stimuli and randomly selected a subset to serve as a training set for each participant. So on day 1 of the study, we each encountered for the first time the stimuli that would be a part of our training set, and that would be incorporated into several tasks that we'd complete, both at home and during fMRI scanning. One of those tasks was a sequence learning serial reaction time task to tap into associative learning and the acquisition of structured knowledge. So here we learned to associate a button press with each stimulus. And some of the training set stimuli were embedded within probabilistic sequences that we learned over time, while others only ever appeared in random order. And all of these stimuli just appeared in a continuous stream, also intermixed with animal and tool stimuli. I'm going to blow through this kind of quickly. I just want to give you the gist of what we did. We also completed a simple working memory task where we needed to just remember a single, either trained or novel stimulus over a variable delay, and then select the memory sample from a set of 3 options. Each of those tasks could be completed on their own at home, but we also completed several blocks of each of them, along with stimulus localizers and multiple periods of rest during our fMRI scanning sessions.
Sorry to interrupt.
And so our training followed the same. Yeah.
I have a quick clarification question. Did you use the same stimulus set for both the sequence learning and the working memory task?
Yes. So there are 18 stimuli, different stimuli for each of us that are in our training set, as well as novel stimuli that are selected anew from session to session for comparison.
Okay, you might see an item in the working memory task that you have associated with a particular sequence in the sequence task.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, thanks.
And then in the sequence task, some stimuli are in sequences and some are not.
Okay, thanks. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, that's relevant. So our training followed this timeline where each purple dot represents an fMRI scan and the blue and green dots represent at-home training. So, we end up with just many, many thousands of trials, hundreds of hours of rest and task scan data we each, ultimately through several different kinds of scans, each scanned ourselves about 30 times and did, many at-home training sessions as well. So, obviously this is a rich data set. We have lots of analyses underway, but we see a wide variety of changes across learning. And I'm just gonna briefly mention a few of them. So we see, improvements just in basic working memory performance for trained stimuli across sessions. And those improvements in performance correspond to changes in the distribution of fMRI delay activity across session. So for instance, when we focus on prefrontal cortex activity, we see both voxels that increase and those that decrease their activity over time. So this was quantified using a voxel-wise regression across sessions, where voxels shown in blue are those that decrease their activity across sessions, but voxels shown in red increase their activity across sessions. And these plots down below are showing the percentage of voxels in each prefrontal ROI that either increased or decreased their activity, plotted over a permuted null distribution. So these red sticks are indicating when a significant percentage of voxels in each prefrontal ROI actually increase their activity over time. So one prefrontal voxel had significant proportion of, one prefrontal ROI had a significant proportion of voxels that decreased their activity. All of the ROIs had more voxels that actually increase their activity across the course of the training. So this is really intriguing to me because I think the conventional wisdom might be that prefrontal recruitment would decrease as this task becomes easier and more practice. But in fact, we see both a change in the distribution of voxels that are recruited, but actually more voxels being recruited over time. So to me, this starts to form a bridge with the monkey data, and that these activity increases could correspond to increasing prefrontal stimulus selectivity with extensive training. And in fact, we also do see item level stimulus patterns for trained stimuli emerging in several PFC ROIs as measured with representational similarity analysis, whereby trained stimulus patterns become more distinct from each other, as well as sequence representations from that serial reaction time task emerging during working memory maintenance, and that patterns for items from within the same sequence become more similar to each other. So, and again, this is during the working memory task that has nothing to do, with the sequence task per se. And finally, we also see an increasing involvement of the hippocampus during the working memory task over the course of training, among several other changes that I won't take the time to talk about right now. But in short, the answer to this last question is, a resounding yes. And the regions and representational patterns for working memory may change not only as a function of stimulus similarity, but also as a function of how stimuli are embedded in knowledge structures and associated with each other in long-term memory. So, there's no single universally true answer to where and how working memory information is stored. So now we're working on combining these factors that I've talked about today with other factors like timing and motivation, and collaborating with modelers to create a comprehensive model that better captures the complexity of how these many factors interact, and also how representations at several levels integrate for real world goal-directed cognition. Because we've seen that both the processes and representations for working memory may shift depending on the particular combination of task demands and depending on existing knowledge structures. So rather than considering working memory as a monolithic core function, we should examine it in the context of the other processes that it interacts with, consider what kind of information is being remembered, and consider how experience and meaning might alter working memory functioning. All right, thank you to my former and current labs, collaborators, funders, and thank you all of you for sticking with me late into your afternoon.
All right, thanks a lot. That was a great talk. Trying to find the virtual clap button. Anyway, I'll get to that later. We have a couple minutes.
I never use it because it just feels so silly.
Well, yeah. Anyway.
I try to just really gesticulate so people can see me clapping.
Consider yourself applauded. Thank you. So yeah, we have a few minutes left for questions. If anyone wants to speak up, just jump in. Yeah, Sage.
Thanks for that. That was super nice. So I actually had a question about the action study, and maybe it's like broader as well. But I was wondering how much of that can be explained by kind of priming rather than active working memory maintenance. So if you had the same sort of study, but you just kind of showed those words without people actively having to maintain the actions in their memory, would you expect that this kind of just like residual, maybe, I don't know, motor priming would also give you these sort of action slips as you had?
Yeah, so my guess is that probably a little bit, but because I have a similar study, the kind of working memory Stroop study that I mentioned earlier, where we did do a priming comparison, and you still see a small Stroop effect from words that you don't need to remember, but the effect is much bigger when you do need to remember. And so kind of critically in this action-oriented study, there were several different experiments that I didn't all talk about today. But so for one, the fact that the proportion of congruent trials modulates the magnitude of the effect indicates that it has something to do with kind of how relevant the working memory goals are to the motor task. But then also in other experiments where we give 2 items to remember and then retro cue among those items with cues of various degrees of validity, we see that sort of attentional prioritization within working memory also modulating the size of the effect. So my strong hypothesis is that yes, you would still see a little bit of sort of just lingering activation from priming, but that it's strongly modulated by the activation state or priority state or whatever relevance of the working memory to your task goals.
Great, thanks.
So feel free to jump in, but I have a question that's kind of a bit broad, so forgive me for that. You mentioned already that it's if working memory is kind of task dependent and can be that storage can be found in all kinds of brain areas depending on your current goal. Is there what do you think are even the unifying aspects of working memory anymore? Either at like a neural level, like what kind of criteria does an area have to fulfill in order to be able to store a working memory for any given task? Or is there no like unifying thing anymore?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the truth is that I have some draft in some folder that I don't know when I'll get back to, that's called like Working Memory's Identity Crisis, or maybe it's my crisis over the fact that we use this term working memory, but it refers to just so many different things, and it's to me kind of lost some of its usefulness, because so many different kinds of tasks with so many different kinds of demands can all fall under this umbrella. And I really think that the processes and representations are going to just be so different depending on some of the demands I talked about, but also many other factors. So I don't know. I guess I come from the perspective that pretty distributed working memory perspective, where representational information, not every region can maintain high integrity, precise, detailed sensory content, but pretty much all across the processing stream, like information can be retained over the short term that is, some level of representation that contributes to working memory. I mean, you're asking me this at a time when I'm like really in the midst of questioning whether this is a valuable construct. So I haven't really narrowed down to be able to articulate a good answer to that question. But I think it's everywhere and everything.
Okay, but your view might change. Thanks. I'll just keep going until I get interrupted. I think we have a few more minutes, but if anyone needs to go, I think people will leave as we get closer to 5 o'clock. Sage has another one.
Sorry, I can also yield to other people who want to talk, but in the last study you showed, the one with the training set, I might have misseen this data, so sorry if I got this wrong, but it look like that in the very early stages of the training, people were actually a bit worse in the working memory task on the training stimuli than they were for the novel stimuli? Is that, I was doing a bit of a cross plot.
You are right. I'm trying to find.
Is this just like interference kind of thing? Like these stimuli are starting to interfere more with each other at that time, or?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and one that this is not actually a slide that was in the talk, but I think it sort of shows this. This just shows the RT, but you're right. No, both the kind of accuracy and RT were weirdly worse. They still improved to get much better than the novel stimuli over time, but they did start out worse. And we have wondered about that and whether it was just a fluke, but think that it makes a little bit of sense because the way that the sessions progressed is that we did the sequence learning training first. Basically, the working memory task was tacked on to the end of every session, and it was just that way, across all sessions. So, on day one, we were first getting exposed to our stimuli. We can't take away all of our knowledge of the experiment because we were the experimenters and subjects. So we knew that these stimuli were going to be embedded in these sequences. So, our kind of anecdotal explanation right now is that because we were doing the sequence training and trying to learn to associate the button responses to these unique stimuli that we were seeing for the first time, that sort of created, interference maybe, or just some kind of additional demand where on that first day, we were putting some effort into trying to learn the stimuli. And, during the working memory task, we already kind of recognized which stimuli were just shown in the sequence task. And, those would kind of capture our attention more. And maybe we would be doing some residual attempt at remembering the buttons associated with them. So, I mean, I don't have a great explanation, but you are right. And I think it's probably not a fluke and probably has to do with the fact that those stimuli kind of took on additional importance compared to the novel stimuli, and we had some additional processing going on associated with them. But that made it, harder for us to remember the important parts of them, because the demands of the sequence task were very different from the working memory task. The sequence task, you just see the whole sequence and it hit a button. The working memory task, we use this sort of windowed display of just a part of the stimulus. So you really needed a very precise memory representation. I mean, it continued to be very hard. None of us really got to a ceiling level of performance. We continued to get better all across the training. So the kind of precision that you needed for the working memory task was very different than what you needed in the stimulus task. And so thinking about the sequences and the responses associated with stimuli would not help you at all in the working memory context.
Do you think, sorry to piggyback, but do you think the fact that you guys never got to ceiling and maybe that this was a really demanding working memory task is also why you continue to see kind of like for that training stimuli, the increase in the frontal areas where it's, if you had maybe a slightly easier or really overlearned simple set of stimuli, you can then maybe release some of that control?
Yeah, that is a great question. And we, what we're trying to do now, I don't have a great answer. What we're trying to do now is look at, basically, we didn't have sort of even memory and performance across the entire stimulus set. Some of them were really easy. Some of them we did basically get to a ceiling level of performance on fairly early on. You know, kind of the learning slope was very different across the stimulus set, whereas some of them just remained really hard for whatever reason, possibly because some of them were more similar to others in the set, so they were more confusable and they just had more similar features. So we are working on now sort of characterizing how our different learning curves correspond to the, you know, the neural activity curves. And yeah, so my hunch is that the ones, that we learned very easily early on are likely going to be, you know, associated with more hippocampal and MTL processing that, you know, supports maintenance just via long-term memory and familiarity. Whereas, maybe the other ones, you know, we just continue to need to put in that effort. So it's a great question. I don't know. I mean, the fact that the distribution changes and we gain, you know, item level, you know, stimulus type representational information in PFC is still intriguing and indicates that there is some sort of shift in the kind of information that's being represented there. But we really need to do more to pull apart, basically which kinds of learning and changes are associated with which changes in neural activity.
Cool, thanks.
And this data will be released on the public somewhat soon for any question that you might want to address.
All right. I think we've run out of time, unfortunately, but thank you again for coming and for your great talk. And thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. True delight.
Thanks.